The Untold Story by Sasha. Chapter 1. The Cold Case. The rain pelted against the windows of the small office as Emily Hayes stared at the aging photograph in front of her. It had been buried for years, its edges yellowed, its once crisp image fading with time, but the face still haunted her. A young woman, her eyes wide with fear, her expression frozen in a moment of desperation. Beneath the photo, a name was scrawled in bold, hurried handwriting, Grace Callahan. Emily leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes as a tired sigh escaped her lips. She had seen that face before, countless times, but it never ceased to stir something deep inside her. Grace Callahan had been missing for 6 years, and her case had long been forgotten by the public. It had been labeled an accident, a tragic story of a woman who had vanished into thin air. But Emily wasn't convinced. There was something more to it, something that no one had bothered to uncover. She ran her fingers over the edges of the case file, its contents organized in neat, labeled folders, but Emily felt the weight of the unsolved mystery pressing down on her. The story that had been told, the one about Grace slipping away, lost to the world, never sat right with her. The facts didn't add up. The whispers she'd heard from her sources in the city had hinted at something darker, something buried beneath the surface. And it was that hidden truth that gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. Emily had been working as an investigative reporter for 5 years, and though her career was still relatively young, she had already uncovered enough corruption and deception to know when something didn't fit. This case was one of those things. Her editor had handed it to her, not knowing the dangerous waters she would be diving into. "A cold case, Emily," he'd said. "Dig into it. If nothing else, it'll give you a story." But Emily knew this was more than just a story. It was a mystery, a web of lies, twisted truths, and power that had been carefully concealed. She had seen what lies beneath the surface of society too many times to ignore the signs. The truth was there, hidden just out of reach, and it was waiting for someone to uncover it. She closed the file with a soft click, her mind racing with the possibilities. Grace Callahan had vanished without a trace, and the case had been all but abandoned. The police had done their part, checked off their boxes, and moved on. But someone had dropped the ball. Someone had let this case slip through the cracks. Emily had already made her first step. She had contacted the detective who had been assigned to the case. A gruff, disillusioned man named Detective Carl Brooks, who had seen too many cases go unsolved and had lost his belief in the system. She'd gotten him on the phone that morning, and after a few words of hesitation, he'd agreed to meet her at his office the following day. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find from him. Perhaps more details, perhaps an insider's perspective. But Emily felt a nagging feeling that he knew more than he let on. She had to hear it from him, directly. The clock on her desk ticked away, and the storm outside intensified. The rhythmic sound of raindrops against the glass was a steady reminder that time was slipping away. Emily had no idea what she was stepping into, but she had already made her decision. She couldn't back out now. She would find Grace Callahan, dead or alive. She gathered the file and tucked it into her bag. The next day would be pivotal, she knew that much. Tomorrow she would get the answers she needed. The next morning, The city was shrouded in mist, the streets wet from the night's downpour. Emily walked quickly, her coat pulled tight around her against the chill. Detective Brooks' office was in a rundown part of town, nestled between a diner and a pawn shop. The smell of grease and stale coffee clung to the air as she approached the small building. A flickering neon sign outside read Brooks Investigations in cracked letters. Inside, the office was cluttered and dimly lit. The walls were lined with boxes of old files, stacks of paperwork, and faded photographs of missing persons and unsolved cases. The air smelled of old paper and stale cigarette smoke. At the back of the room, a tall man sat hunched over a desk, his face half lit by the flickering lamp. Detective Carl Brooks. He looked up as Emily entered, his tired eyes scrutinizing her. His face was rough, unshaven, a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. There was a heaviness about him, as if the weight of the unsolved cases had slowly crushed his spirit. "You're the reporter," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Emily nodded, setting her bag down on the desk. "Emily Hayes. I'm looking into the Grace Callahan case. I know it's been closed, but I believe there's more to it." Brooks didn't speak at first. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly as he seemed to weigh his words. "That case," he began, his voice trailing off. "It's a mess. We thought we had it all figured out. An unfortunate accident. A woman who got too drunk and wandered off into the woods. End of story." Emily leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed a stack of papers to one side, revealing an old, worn folder. He opened it slowly, as if he had been avoiding it for years. The photo of Grace Callahan was the first thing Emily saw. Her face, frozen in time, stared back at them. "There's something about this case that never sat right with me," Brooks muttered. "Too many questions, too many things we couldn't explain. The police moved on, but I couldn't. I never believed it was an accident." Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "What did you find?" she asked, leaning closer. Brooks looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't find much, but I've got a few theories. And I don't think Grace's death was random. There's something bigger at play here, something far more dangerous than we ever realized." The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Emily could feel the weight of his words, and she knew that whatever he was about to say could change everything. "There's a conspiracy, Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One that goes higher than you could ever imagine. Corrupt cops, powerful politicians. People who wanted Grace Callahan gone for a reason." Emily's pulse quickened. This was more than she had ever expected. And now, it seemed, she was standing at the edge of something much darker. Brooks looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and urgency. "You're in this now, Emily. There's no turning back. They won't let you get close to the truth." And with that, the room fell silent as the storm outside raged on. Chapter 2. The thread unravels. Emily sat in her car for a long while after leaving Detective Brooks' office. The rain had stopped, but the wet streets gleamed with the lingering reflection of streetlights. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as she stared out the windshield, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. A conspiracy, corruption within the police force and political circles. She had expected answers, but nothing had prepared her for the depth of what Brooks was suggesting. The mention of Grace Callahan's death being tied to powerful forces only added weight to the mystery, and to the danger she was now walking into. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just a cold case anymore. This was a tangled mess of deceit, of people in power trying to bury a truth that would likely destroy them if it came to light. Emily didn't know whether to be terrified or thrilled. She had spent years chasing stories, uncovering hidden truths in the shadows. But this felt different. She had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went or how far the people involved were willing to go to keep it all buried. Her phone buzzed in her lap, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing a message from her editor, Alex Martin. What did Brooks say? Got anything solid? Emily stared at the message for a moment before typing her response. He confirmed something's off. The case is far from closed. I'm digging deeper. We'll keep you posted. She hit send and sighed, rubbing her temples. Alex was right to be eager for progress. The pressure from the newsroom was building. Stories like this could make careers or they could ruin them. She had no intention of letting it ruin hers, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. Not with what Brooks had hinted at. With a deep breath, she turned the key in the ignition, pulling away from the curb. There was one person she needed to visit next. Grace's family. They had to know something, anything that could give her more to work with. A victim's family might not always be the best source of information, but Emily had a feeling they were about to become a crucial part of the puzzle. The Callahan residence was on the outskirts of the city, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where the houses were large but slightly dated, their lawns immaculately manicured. Grace's parents had lived here for as long as anyone could remember. From the outside, everything looked normal, almost too normal. The kind of picture-perfect suburban life that masked the chaos beneath the surface. Emily parked her car in the driveway and hesitated for a moment, staring at the front door. It had been 6 years since Grace's disappearance, but the house looked frozen in time, as though it hadn't aged a day. The curtains were drawn, and the lights inside flickered dimly. Emily had done her research on Grace's family. Her mother, Rebecca Callahan, was a well-known artist, and her father, Thomas Callahan, had worked as a corporate lawyer in a prestigious firm. Both had been described as grief-stricken and reluctant to speak to the media after Grace's disappearance. But now, after speaking with Brooks, Emily knew there was more to their story than grief. There was fear. There was something lurking behind their carefully curated public image. Emily stepped out of the car, adjusting her coat, and walked to the front door. As her knuckles rapped against the wood, the silence seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with disheveled hair and eyes that looked far too tired for someone so young. Rebecca Callahan stood in the doorway, her gaze appraising Emily with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. She was dressed in a loose sweater and faded jeans, as though she had just woken up. Despite her tired appearance, There was an underlying strength in her posture. A woman who had been forced to survive on something far more resilient than just hope. Yes, Rebecca's voice was cautious, guarded. I'm Emily Hayes, a reporter. Emily began, her tone steady but soft. I've been investigating the disappearance of your daughter, Grace. I know it's been a long time, but I believe there's more to the case than what's been reported. I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing. Rebecca's eyes flickered with a flash of something. Uncertainty, maybe fear. But she stepped aside, motioning for Emily to come in. We've already told the police everything we know. I'm not sure there's anything else for you to uncover. Emily hesitated, but only for a second. She knew she had to tread carefully. I understand, but I think the police missed something. A lot of people have turned a blind eye to what happened to Grace, and I believe there's a reason for that. I'm not trying to cause any more pain, but I need your help. Rebecca's gaze hardened, her fingers tightening on the doorframe as if she were bracing for an unseen blow. We've been through enough. I don't know what you think you can find, but if you're looking for a story, you're barking up the wrong tree. Emily took a step closer, her voice lower now, more urgent. I'm not here for a story, Mrs. Callahan. I'm here because someone is trying to cover up the truth. And your daughter's death? It's connected to something much bigger than anyone realizes. Rebecca's face went pale, her hand trembling slightly as she let go of the door. She stepped back, silently motioning for Emily to come in. I don't know what you're talking about, but if you want to hear about Grace, you're going to have to hear the whole story. All of it. As Emily entered the house, the air inside felt heavy, thick with the weight of years of unspoken grief and secrets. The faint scent of paint lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the dark shadows that clung to the walls. Rebecca led her to the living room, where old photographs of Grace adorned every surface. There was a photo of her as a young girl in a ballet costume, another of her standing next to her parents at what looked like a holiday dinner. But what struck Emily was the picture that hung above the fireplace. Grace, her face frozen in a moment of happiness, her eyes bright, her smile unguarded. Grace was everything to us, Rebecca said softly, sitting down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was bright, talented. She had her whole life ahead of her. But then she disappeared, and it was like the world stopped for us. It's been 6 years, and every day feels like we're still waiting for her to walk through that door. Emily sat down across from her, her gaze focused on the photo above the fireplace. You don't believe it was an accident, do you? Rebecca's eyes flickered, her lips trembling as though she was on the verge of breaking. I don't know what to believe anymore. I just want to know what happened to her. But it's like everyone's forgotten, like they want us to forget. There's something more, Emily said quietly, her voice steady. I've been talking to Detective Brooks. He thinks Grace's case was no accident. He believes there's something or someone trying to bury the truth. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's not just the police. It's the people who don't want the truth to come out. Powerful people. People who've been pulling the strings for a long time. Emily leaned forward. This was the moment she had been waiting for. What do you mean? Who? Rebecca looked at her, her gaze full of fear and uncertainty. The less you know, the better, Emily. But I'll tell you this, whoever did this to Grace, they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays buried. And you're about to dig up a past that won't stay dead. A chill ran down Emily's spine. The words hung in the air, ominous and foreboding. She didn't know who she was up against, but she was about to find out. The game had already begun, and it was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The masks we wear. The air felt dense, as though it was alive with the weight of the secrets that hung in the room. Emily sat across from Rebecca Callahan, her mind whirling as the woman's words echoed in her ears. Powerful people, people who wanted the truth buried. She could see the fear in Rebecca's eyes, the deep, gnawing terror of a mother who had already lost her daughter and now feared losing something much worse. Her own life. The room was quiet for a long moment, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling. The faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside added an eerie undertone to the heavy silence that enveloped them. Rebecca's hands were still clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared at the floor, as though trying to summon the courage to speak, to share more of the truth Emily so desperately needed. Emily wasn't about to push too hard. Not yet. She needed Rebecca to trust her, to believe that she wasn't here for the story but for the truth. That, in the end, was what mattered. The truth, no matter how dark it might be. After a long, taut silence, Rebecca finally spoke, her voice low and steady, though it trembled with underlying fear. You think Grace's case was just another missing persons file? Another cold case? She asked, her eyes flicking up to meet Emily's. Emily nodded slowly. I thought it was, but now I'm starting to think it was something else, something much bigger. Rebecca inhaled deeply, her breath shaky. Grace was involved with someone she shouldn't have been. The revelation struck Emily like a punch to the gut. She had been expecting a lot of things, but not this. Who? Emily asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Who was she involved with? Rebecca's lips tightened, and she looked away for a moment, as though struggling with a memory she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. A man named Robert Pierce. He was a politician, big shot in the city. I didn't know at first. I thought she was just seeing a boy her age. But as time went on, I realized it was more than that. Emily felt a jolt of recognition at the name. Robert Pierce. She had read about him in passing, a rising star in the city's political scene. Charismatic, influential, and known for his philanthropic efforts, at least that's how the media painted him. But behind every well-polished image, there was always something lurking in the shadows. How did you find out? Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. This was the first real lead. This could be the key to unlocking everything. Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the coffee table, her fingers brushing against the rim before she took a long sip. I started noticing things, small things. Grace would come home late, look over her shoulder when she thought no one was watching. She started being careful about what she said, who she talked to. I tried to ask her, but she brushed me off. She didn't want me to know. but she was scared, I could tell. The silence between them deepened as the weight of the words settled in. Emily could see it now. Grace had been entangled in something dangerous, something she hadn't fully understood. And now, 6 years later, it seemed that those same forces were determined to keep the truth buried. Rebecca's voice faltered as she continued, her eyes distant, as though lost in the memories. I don't know how far it went, but Grace was afraid. She didn't want to talk about it, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Robert Pierce wasn't just a politician. He was involved in things I didn't understand. And when she tried to pull away from him, she trailed off, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance, a haunted look clouding her face. That's when everything started going wrong. Emily leaned forward, sensing the gravity of what Rebecca was saying. What do you mean? What happened when she tried to pull away? Rebecca's expression hardened, her face contorting with a mix of anger and sorrow. She started receiving threats, strange phone calls. Someone had been watching her. I'm not sure who, but it wasn't just Robert. There were others, powerful people, people who were tied to him. And when Grace tried to tell the police, they dismissed it, said she was paranoid, that it was nothing. Emily felt her stomach churn. The dots were connecting now, each one revealing a darker, more insidious picture. Powerful people, untouchable people had been involved, and they had used the system, the very people who were supposed to protect Grace, to silence her. Did she say anything else? Emily pressed. Anything specific that might help me figure out what happened to her? Rebecca's hands gripped the edge of the couch, her eyes filled with desperation. She told me she had evidence. Something that could take down Robert Pierce and the people who were protecting him. She said she was going to the police with it, but I never got to see it. I never knew what it was. She told me to be careful, to stay away from it, that if anything happened to her, I needed to protect myself. I thought she was just scared, but now, she trailed off, her eyes welling with tears. Now, I'm afraid she knew something was coming. The finality in her voice hit Emily like a ton of bricks. Grace had known. She had been preparing for something terrible to happen. And whatever it was, it had come to pass. Emily could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, each new revelation adding a layer of depth to the mystery. The political connections, the corruption, the powerful people trying to silence her. It was all part of something much bigger. I'm going to find out what happened to her, Emily said, her voice resolute, and I'm going to make sure the people responsible pay for what they did. Rebecca's gaze softened, a fleeting glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. Be careful, Emily. The more you dig, the more dangerous it becomes. These people, they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. Emily nodded, but the determination in her heart burned brighter than ever. She had already come too far to turn back now. The darkness that had claimed Grace's life was the same darkness threatening to swallow everything Emily held dear. But she wasn't afraid of the shadows. She was going to drag them into the light, no matter the cost. As she left the Callahan house, the weight of Rebecca's words pressed heavily on her chest. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but she also knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Grace's story be forgotten. Not now, not ever. Chapter 4. Into the abyss. The rain began to fall in sheets as Emily drove through the desolate streets, the headlights of her car cutting through the thick, oppressive darkness. Each drop that slammed against the windshield seemed to add to the weight pressing on her chest. The night was thick with tension, and the more she uncovered about the case, the more she felt like she was stepping into a world that had long since been buried by people with power, by people with secrets. Rebecca's words echoed in her mind as she drove, the thought of Grace's final moments lingering like a dark cloud. She had evidence. The words kept spinning, a mantra that Emily couldn't shake. What kind of evidence could Grace have had that would have threatened Robert Pierce and the people behind him? The thought of powerful politicians, shadowy figures who operated in the depths of corruption, sent a shiver through her spine. Emily knew that if she was going to uncover the truth, she had to get closer to the heart of the conspiracy. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous the trail would become. But she was prepared to face it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled over to the side of the road and answered without checking the caller ID. "Emily," came a deep voice, one she recognized immediately. It was Detective Mason, the one person in law enforcement who hadn't shut her out of the investigation. At least not yet. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her limbs. "I've been running some checks on Robert Pierce," Mason said, his voice low. "The deeper I dig, the more I'm starting to believe there's something off about him. And not just the usual political dirt." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Everything about his background seems too clean. His rise to power, unusually quick even for someone with connections. But there's something else, a missing file. A case from years ago that seems to have vanished into thin air. It's like someone wiped it off the records entirely. But I'm digging deeper. I think we may be onto something." The rain began to hammer harder against the roof of her car as Emily gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. A missing file? That could be the key to everything. "You think it's connected to Grace's disappearance?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but it's worth looking into. I'll keep you posted. Just be careful, okay?" Before she could respond, the line went dead. Emily's grip tightened around the phone, her knuckles white. She had no intention of backing down now. Not when she was so close. The rain was relentless as she pulled back onto the road, her thoughts spinning as she navigated the slippery streets. Mason's words hung heavy in the air, each one seeming to push her forward into the unknown. If there was a missing file, then it was likely someone had deliberately hidden it. But why? What could possibly be so dangerous that it had to be erased from history? Her destination was clear, the old records office. If she was going to find answers, it had to be there. The building loomed in the distance, its windows dark, a relic from a time long gone. The records office was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, in a rundown part of town where no one seemed to go unless they had a reason. Emily parked her car a few blocks away, knowing it was better to walk than risk drawing attention by parking too close. As she made her way toward the building, she could feel the weight of the rain-soaked night pressing down on her, as though the city itself was trying to warn her away. The office was locked up tight when she arrived, but that didn't stop her. She'd been here before, back in her early years as a reporter, and she knew how to get inside without attracting attention. A few quiet steps, a well-placed shove, and she was through the back door. The air inside was cold and stale, the faint smell of dust lingering in the corners of the room. She moved quickly, her footsteps echoing off the tile floors as she navigated the maze of filing cabinets and old records. The entire building seemed frozen in time, each file holding secrets that had long been forgotten or hidden away. As she passed row after row of cabinets, she stopped at one in particular, labeled Unsolved Cases. Her pulse quickened. This was where they kept the records of the missing persons, the cold cases, the stories that had never seen the light of day. She yanked open a drawer, her fingers trembling as she sifted through the brittle files, and then she found it. The case file was marked with a familiar name, Grace Callahan. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, but there was something wrong. The file was incomplete, the details sparse, the pages disjointed as though they had been ripped apart and hastily put back together. She frowned. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was something else. A series of photographs fell out from between the pages. She bent down to pick them up, her breath catching as she recognized the images. Grace Callahan. But these weren't the same photographs that had been shown in the press. These were private, personal shots. Grace standing with someone she didn't recognize. Her arm draped over his shoulder, smiling as if they were friends. But the man in the photo wasn't just any stranger. He looked familiar. Emily's blood ran cold as she stared at the face of the man in the picture. It was Robert Pierce. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning, and suddenly, everything she had uncovered, everything she had suspected, fell into place. Grace had been close to Pierce, too close, and now, with the file in her hands, Emily understood that Grace had known more than anyone realized. She had uncovered something dangerous, something connected to Pierce's rise to power. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form, but Emily knew she wasn't safe. If Pierce was involved in this, if he had been involved in Grace's disappearance, then she was already in too deep. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she quickly stuffed the photographs back into the file and turned, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't alone. Chapter 5. Shadows and Whispers. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the dusty room, so soft and measured that Emily could almost convince herself it was the wind. But she knew better. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she instinctively moved toward the nearest stack of files, her mind racing to process the discovery she had just made. Robert Pierce, in the photograph with Grace. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in on her. She slowly slid the file back into the drawer, her hands trembling, and reached for her phone, preparing to dial Mason. But before she could press the first digit, a voice sliced through the silence. "You should be more careful, Emily." Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, instinctively reaching for the phone like it could somehow protect her from the man standing in the doorway. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, his silhouette sharp against the darkness beyond. Pierce. Robert Pierce. The man whose name had haunted the city for years, now standing in front of her in the most unexpected of places. His face was a mask of calm, his posture relaxed as if he hadn't just been lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. His tailored suit seemed out of place in the dilapidated office, but his presence was unnervingly confident. Almost predatory, Emily froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The truth she had uncovered, the connection between Pierce and Grace, had just taken a dangerous turn. How had he known she was here? More importantly, how much did he know? "I'm sure you've figured it out by now," Pierce continued, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. Grace was more than just a missing person. She knew things that could unravel everything. But it's too late for her now. And it might be too late for you, too. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't back down now. She had come too far, discovered too much. And yet, standing face to face with the man who seemed to have orchestrated it all, she realized just how deep she had waded into the darkness. But she couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. "What are you talking about?" she managed to say, her voice steady despite the terror rising within her. Pierce's lips curled into a thin, cold smile. He stepped further into the room, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with each deliberate step. He was so close now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the calculated gleam in his gaze. "You think this is just about Grace? This isn't about one woman. This is about control, power, the things people like you will never understand. You dig too deep, and you threaten to expose the very foundation of everything we've built." He paused, his eyes flicking to the drawer where Emily had hidden the file. "But I suppose it's too late for subtlety now." Emily's breath quickened. The realization hit her like a wave. Pierce wasn't just involved in Grace's disappearance. He was at the center of something much larger, something that threatened to tear apart everything in its path. The evidence she had uncovered, the missing file, the photographs. They weren't just pieces of a puzzle. They were the key to a dark web that connected the powerful, the corrupt, and the criminal. "I won't stop," Emily said, her voice sharp with resolve. She wasn't sure if she believed it herself, but she couldn't show weakness. "Not now. I'll find out what really happened to Grace." Pierce's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion. "You're already too late. Grace made her choice, and now so must you." With that, he stepped back, his figure melting into the shadows. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound of the rain outside seemed to grow louder, pounding against the windows like a relentless drumbeat, as though the world itself was warning her. But she wasn't ready to back down. Not now, not ever. With trembling hands, she pulled the drawer open again and retrieved the file. This time she wouldn't be careless. She would get the truth no matter the cost. She had to. For Grace. For herself. Emily took one last look around the dim office, her mind buzzing with the weight of what she had just discovered. There were pieces missing from the puzzle, gaps in the story that only Pierce could fill. But she wasn't going to stop until she had everything. Everything that would bring the conspiracy to light. Everything that would expose Pierce for the monster he truly was. As she made her way toward the exit, her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She answered it quickly, her pulse still racing. "Mason," she said, trying to steady her breath. "I found something. It's worse than we thought." "What happened?" Mason's voice crackled through the line. "Pierce is involved," Emily said, her voice tight. "He's been hiding something much bigger than we could have imagined. Grace wasn't just a victim. She was part of a much larger conspiracy. And I think he's been manipulating the investigation from the start." Mason was silent for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice low and tense. "Where are you?" "I'm leaving now," she replied. "I need to get out of here. Get to the car. Don't stop moving. I've got backup coming your way." Emily didn't hesitate. She hung up the phone and hurried toward the back door. But just as she reached for the handle, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. The door swung open with a creak, and she froze. Standing on the other side was another figure, one she hadn't expected, someone who had been in the shadows all along. Detective Mason. But he wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, men she didn't recognize. They wore dark suits, their expressions unreadable. "Mason," Emily said, her voice a whisper, her stomach sinking. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his face hardening. "But you've been asking too many questions." And just like that, Emily realized the full extent of the trap she had walked into. The game had changed. Chapter 6. The walls close in. The cold metal of the door pressed against Emily's palm as she stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Detective Mason's face, once a trusted ally, was now a mask of resolve, of something darker. Her mind spun, racing to make sense of the scene before her. But the truth seemed to slip further from her grasp with every passing second. She couldn't breathe. The men standing with Mason were unfamiliar, but the hardness in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. There would be no escape now. Her phone, still in her pocket, felt like a foreign object, useless, her last lifeline to the outside world slipping away. "Emily, step away from the door," Mason ordered, his voice unrecognizable. There was no trace of the man who had once been her partner in this investigation. Only a stranger she didn't know, someone who was willing to betray her. "Don't move," one of the men next to Mason added, his voice low, authoritative. The glint of a gun at his waist was enough to make Emily's heart freeze. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The pieces she had so carefully put together, the threads of a story that she thought she controlled. Everything was unraveling now, faster than she could react. "What's going on, Mason?" Emily's voice was shaky, but she couldn't allow herself to show weakness. Not now. "Why are you doing this? You were helping me." Mason's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the flicker of guilt crossed his features. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and hard, and he spoke again, his voice flat. "You should have stopped digging when you had the chance. There's no turning back now, Emily." Her breath caught in her throat. He was involved. It wasn't just Pierce, it was him too. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. "You've been working with him, haven't you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it more real. "You're part of this. You're part of the conspiracy." Mason didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "It was never meant to go this far, Emily. But you forced our hand." The weight of his words settled on her like a physical blow. Betrayal. It burned through her, and she could feel the sting of it, hot and bitter. She had trusted him, confided in him, and now he was one of them. A part of the very machine that had buried Grace's murder, that had protected the corrupt and powerful who had orchestrated it all. Why? Her voice was barely above a whisper, a broken sound. "Why betray me?" Mason's gaze softened for the briefest moment, but it quickly hardened again, like a shield snapping back into place. "Because you don't understand, Emily. There are things in motion far bigger than you or me. We're not in control anymore. We never were." The other men flanking him stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Emily took a step back, her pulse quickening. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The trap was set, and she was caught in it. "You're coming with us?" one of the men said. His tone was calm, but the threat was undeniable. Now, Emily's mind raced, trying to think of an escape plan, trying to figure out how to get out of this, out of the nightmare that had become her life. But it was too late for plans. Mason's betrayal had sealed her fate. She could feel the walls closing in around her, each breath more labored than the last. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Emily snapped, her voice shaking with defiance, even as her stomach churned. "You can't keep me here. You'll never get away with this." One of the men chuckled darkly. "We already have." In that moment, everything she had worked for, everything she had uncovered, felt like it was slipping through her fingers like sand. Grace's murder, the conspiracy, the corruption in the police force. It was all part of a web too large for one person to untangle, and now Emily was stuck in the middle of it, with no one to turn to. Mason reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a set of handcuffs. The click of metal echoed in the silence of the room. Emily's eyes flicked to the door, to the window behind her, but there was no escape. The truth had become her enemy. She was a threat now, a threat that needed to be silenced. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Mason said, his voice almost apologetic. He reached for her wrist, but Emily jerked away, her eyes burning with fury. "You won't get away with this," she hissed, her words like daggers. "I'll make sure the world knows what you've done. You'll all pay for this." Mason's face hardened, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something like regret, in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by cold indifference. "We're done here," Mason said flatly. "Take her." As the two men stepped forward, Emily's mind raced. There had to be something, anything, that she could do to turn the tide. Her body tensed, ready to fight, but the odds were against her. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a room with no way out. The darkness was closing in fast, suffocating her with its weight. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She still had a weapon, a secret weapon, the truth. Do you really think this will end well for you? Emily's voice was calm now, controlled. You're already in too deep. Once I'm gone, the evidence will be out there. The world will know. Mason hesitated. For the briefest moment, he seemed to doubt himself, his eyes flicking toward the men around him. But it was just a moment, a fleeting moment of weakness. I'm sorry, Emily, Mason said, his voice barely a whisper. I really am. With one final, resigned look, he gestured for the men to move. Emily tried to brace herself, but as the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around her wrists, she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't go down without a fight. She would find a way out of this. She would survive. But in that moment, as she was led out of the room, she realized something chilling. Mason was no longer her partner. He was part of the enemy now. And she was alone. Chapter 7. Shattered Trust. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Emily's wrists as she was led down the narrow hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt like it was taking her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Detective Mason's betrayal was still fresh in her mind, and the weight of his cold indifference pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. She had trusted him. They had been partners in this, walking the same path toward the truth. Or so she thought. Now that trust was shattered, and in its place, there was only a gaping void. What was she supposed to do when the very people she had relied on had become her enemies? The men who flanked her were silent, their eyes cold and watchful. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Emily could feel it in the pit of her stomach. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for her to make a move, waiting for her to slip up, to give them a reason to silence her. Her mind raced as she tried to find a way out of this. There had to be something. She wasn't just going to sit back and let them win. She had come too far, uncovered too much, to just disappear into the shadows. But her options were limited, and every passing second brought her closer to a fate she couldn't control. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, a thick, metal door with no windows, no escape. The men didn't speak as one of them slid a key into the lock, turning it with a satisfying click. The door creaked open, and Emily was shoved inside, her back hitting the cold concrete wall with a jarring thud. The room was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor. It looked like an interrogation room, sterile, uninviting, and cold. There was a single chair in the center of the room, and as Emily was shoved toward it, she didn't hesitate. She took a seat, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of weakness in her captors. Mason stepped in behind her, the door slamming shut with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't escape. Not now. Not with him here. The very man who had once stood by her side was now her prison guard. What's this all about, Mason? Emily's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. An edge she hadn't had before. What do you want from me? Mason didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his back to her, his hand resting on the chair beside him. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, like he was searching for the right words, the right excuse to justify what he had done. But there were no words. There was no excuse that could erase the betrayal. "You don't understand," Mason finally said, his voice low and distant. "You never did." Emily's brow furrowed. "Understand what? That you're willing to throw everything away for a bunch of corrupt cops and politicians? You think this will end well for you?" Mason's expression hardened, and for the briefest moment, Emily saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that wasn't quite guilt, but close. "I'm doing what I have to do to survive, Emily. You don't know what's at stake here. The people you're trying to expose, they don't care about us, about you, about anyone." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Mason wasn't just a pawn in this game. He was a player, a willing participant. He had chosen his side. And now, she was the one in the way. "So this is it then?" Emily's voice was steady, but inside, she felt her world shifting. The walls were closing in, and the very people who were supposed to protect her were now the ones pulling her down into the depths. "You're just going to let them get away with murder? With everything they've done? You don't understand?" Mason repeated, his voice tinged with frustration. "You never did. This isn't just about murder, Emily. This is about power, about control. You think you can just expose the truth and everything will be okay? That's not how the world works." Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. Power, control. Was that all this was? A Game of Thrones, where the lives of innocent people, her life, were nothing more than pawns on a chessboard? Had Mason always been this way, hiding behind a facade of justice while pulling the strings from the shadows? "Then what happens now?" Emily asked, her voice cold. "You're going to lock me up and throw away the key?" "No," Mason said, his voice heavy with something like regret. "But I can't let you keep digging, Emily. I can't let you ruin everything. If you do, it's not just your life at risk. It's everyone's. The people you care about, the people you trust." The implication hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Emily's stomach churned. The stakes had just gotten higher, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. She had already lost everything: her career, her trust in the system, her faith in the people who were supposed to uphold justice. Now she was being told to stop, to walk away from it all, or else face the consequences. But Emily wasn't a quitter. She couldn't back down now. Not when she was so close. Not when the truth was within reach. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said, her voice fierce. "You can't scare me into silence. You can't make me forget what I know." Mason's gaze darkened. "You don't have a choice." And just like that, the last shred of hope Emily had left vanished. She was alone in this fight now. Alone in a room with the very people she had once trusted. Alone and at their mercy. But even as the darkness threatened to consume her, Emily felt something stir inside of her. A determination, a fire that hadn't been there before. She wasn't going to let Mason or anyone take her down without a fight. If she had to burn it all to the ground, she would. Chapter 8. The breaking point. The harsh buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead echoed in Emily's ears as she sat in the cold, sterile room, her hands still cuffed to the chair. The longer she stayed here, the more her resolve hardened. The darkness of her situation seemed to close in, but she wouldn't let it swallow her whole. There was no turning back now. No matter how deep the betrayal, she was still breathing, still fighting. And that meant there was still hope. But what kind of hope could she hold on to when even the very people she'd counted on had turned against her? Her mind raced through every piece of the puzzle she had uncovered so far. Detective Mason's betrayal was only the beginning. She had been drawn into something much larger, something darker than she had ever imagined. Corruption ran deep, tangled within the very system that was supposed to protect the innocent. The conspiracy she had stumbled upon was like a spider's web, its threads stretching across law enforcement, politics, and beyond. And now it was pulling her in. She was aware of the passage of time only in fragments. Flashes of movement outside the door, the ticking of a clock, the gnawing feeling that something was about to break. Either she would shatter, or she would break them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the door swinging open. Mason entered, his face unreadable. He hadn't been back since the cold conversation earlier. Emily wasn't sure whether he was still the man she had once worked beside or just another puppet of the system she had been trying to expose. The man she had trusted had slipped away, replaced by someone else, someone who was part of the rot. "You should sit down," he said, his voice empty of any warmth. Emily didn't move. "I don't need to sit, Mason. I need answers. I need you to tell me what the hell is going on." Mason didn't respond immediately, his eyes avoiding hers as if he didn't want to face the reality of what he had become. His guilt was palpable, but so was his determination to keep her in the dark, to keep her locked in this room where the truth couldn't escape. Emily could see it now. This was a man who had been trapped by his own choices, shackled by his loyalties, and now he was trying to justify it. He walked over to a chair and sat down across from her. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping in an erratic rhythm. "You don't know what you're up against," he said finally, his tone softer, almost apologetic. "You never did." "Then tell me," Emily shot back, leaning forward. "What am I up against, Mason? What is this? What have you dragged me into?" For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze flickered to the door, then back to Emily, as if considering whether to tell her more, or whether to keep the fragile illusion intact for just a little longer. Emily wasn't sure how much longer she could stand the silence, the uncertainty gnawing at her. "The truth isn't easy to swallow," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it's easier to pretend you don't see it, to ignore the rot that festers just beneath the surface." Emily's brow furrowed. "You're talking in riddles. Just tell me what you know, Mason. Who is behind this?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't understand. These people, they don't play by the same rules. They've been at this for years, maybe decades. They know how to control things. They know how to manipulate the truth and twist it to suit their needs. And if you dig too deep, they'll bury you with it." Emily could feel her pulse quicken. "Who, Mason? Who are you talking about? Who's pulling the strings?" Mason's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "You're not ready to hear that. Not yet. I'm ready now." Emily insisted. You've kept me in the dark long enough. I'm not walking away from this. I won't just forget what I found. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the window. For a brief moment, he looked out at the night, as though weighing his next words. You're already in too deep, Emily. You think you're trying to expose the truth, but you're just another pawn in their game. The real game. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. You've been playing the game, not me. I'm just trying to stop it. I'm trying to stop them from destroying everything I care about. Mason turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He seemed torn, caught between the loyalty to his own actions and the truth he knew he had to face. It was a painful look, the kind of inner battle that could destroy a man. You don't understand, Mason said again, but this time there was no conviction behind it, only weariness. You don't know who you're dealing with. And you do, Emily asked. Then tell me who they are. Tell me everything. He took a deep breath, then finally spoke, his voice low and resigned. It's not just corrupt cops or crooked politicians. It's much bigger than that. It's a network of power, businessmen, judges, people who are above the law. The ones who can make a phone call and make things disappear. The ones who have been running the city from the shadows. The ones who think they can do whatever they want because no one can stop them. Emily sat in stunned silence. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. All this time, she had been chasing something she thought she understood, but now she realized how little she had actually known. The conspiracy was a beast with many heads, and even if she exposed one, there would always be another waiting in the shadows. Mason's eyes softened. You're not going to win this, Emily. You're just one person, and if you keep pushing, you'll end up like everyone else who tried. You'll disappear. Emily's heart thundered in her chest. The threat was real and it was closing in fast. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let them win. Not when she was this close. She had a choice. Give up or push through the darkness and fight for the truth. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. I'm not going anywhere, Mason. Not until I finish what I started. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Emily's eyes locked with his one last time before he turned and left the room, leaving her alone in the dark. She wasn't afraid anymore. If they thought they could break her, they were wrong. This was just the beginning, and she was going to see it through. Chapter 9. The final reveal. The air was thick with tension as Emily sat in the small, dimly lit office. The faint hum of an overhead fan, the only sound that filled the otherwise silent room. Her eyes were fixed on the man sitting across from her, his face an impassive mask, but she could see the subtle twitch of his hand, the only sign of nervousness. Detective Mason had been her ally, then her enemy, and now somewhere in between. And yet, in this moment, Emily knew that his loyalty was about to be tested in ways neither of them had ever imagined. Her mind was clouded with questions. Too many unanswered questions. The deeper she dug, the more it seemed like she was sinking into a quicksand of lies and half-truths, with every step making her further entangled in a web that she couldn't escape. You said you knew who was behind all this? Emily said, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Now's the time to tell me. I don't have any more patience to waste. Mason remained silent, staring at her. His hands were folded on the table, but the tension in his posture was undeniable. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between what he knew was right and what he feared would happen if the truth ever came to light. How much longer do you think you can keep this up? Emily pressed. They're watching us. They know everything we do. The walls are closing in, Mason. He shifted in his seat, and for a moment, Emily thought he was going to speak. Then he leaned forward, his voice a low whisper. It's bigger than just us. It's bigger than you think. The words hung in the air like a threat, and Emily's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Who's behind this? Mason's eyes flickered toward the door, as if making sure they were still alone. Then he dropped his gaze, staring at the table as though the words weighed heavily on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. The people you're looking for, they aren't just hiding in the shadows. They are the shadows. You've been chasing the wrong ghosts all along. Emily's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Mason let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his face with one hand before he looked back at her, the weight of his next words making him seem smaller than usual. The corruption, the murder, it's all part of a much larger plan. You've been investigating a single thread, but it's a part of something much bigger. Something that's been happening for decades, maybe longer. Emily's heart raced. What are you saying? Who's behind this? Mason leaned back, his eyes darting around the room nervously. The very people who run this city, Emily. The ones you think are safe. The ones you trust. The ones you've relied on your entire career. Emily's throat went dry. You're not talking about the mayor, are you? Mason's lips curled into a bitter smile. No, not just the mayor. It's not that simple. Emily swallowed hard. Her mind was reeling. She had suspected corruption, but she never imagined that the conspiracy went this deep. This wasn't just about a few bad apples in law enforcement. This was about the system itself. The very people who were meant to uphold the law were the ones orchestrating the crimes. What do I do now? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How do I expose something like this? Mason shook his head. You can't. Not without risking your life. You've seen what happens to people who dig too deep. I'm not trying to scare you, Emily. I'm just trying to save you from the inevitable. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had come too far to back down now. Emily's eyes locked onto Mason's, and for a brief moment, she saw the fear in his gaze. You're not going to stop me, she said, her voice firm with determination. I'll expose them, Mason. I have to. Mason hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. You can't do it alone, he finally said, his voice raw with a mix of frustration and regret. You need to trust me, Emily. I can help you, but you have to understand. I'm not who I used to be. I've made my choices, and now I have to live with them. Emily's mind raced. Could she trust him again? Was he still the man who had once fought alongside her for justice? Or was he simply another pawn in the game? I'll do whatever it takes, Emily said, standing up from her seat. "But I need your help, Mason. This is bigger than both of us now." There was a long pause before Mason finally spoke again. "Okay, but we're doing this my way." Emily nodded. "Tell me what I need to do." The conversation had barely begun when the door to the office suddenly creaked open. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill racing down Emily's spine. Mason's head snapped toward the door, his eyes wide with panic. He shot to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. But it was too late. A figure stepped into the room, silhouetted by the harsh light from the hallway. Emily's heart stopped in her chest. She knew that figure, knew that face. It was a face she had seen too many times in the files, in the photos. The face of the one person she thought she could trust. "Hello, Emily," the man said, his voice cold and calculated. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Emily's stomach dropped. It was the mayor. Chapter 10, The Last Act. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process the sight before her. The man standing in the doorway, Mayor Charles Davis, was the last person she ever expected to see in this office. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, but the revelation hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. "Mayor Davis," Emily said, her voice laced with disbelief. You're behind all of this." The mayor's smile was cold, calculated. There was no warmth in it. It was a smile that spoke of power, of secrets buried so deep that they could never be unearthed. "Not everything, Emily," he replied, his tone smooth, like a predator toying with its prey. "But yes, I've had a hand in orchestrating quite a bit. You have to understand, sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lie." Emily felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't let the fear show on her face. She wasn't going down without a fight, not after everything she'd uncovered. "What's your game, Davis? All the murders, the cover-ups, the corruption in the department. It was you all along." The mayor stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silence. There was something menacing about his presence, a sense of inevitability that made the air around them feel thicker. "You've been chasing shadows, Emily," Davis said, his voice quiet, almost pitying. "You've been so focused on the dead ends, the small-time criminals who didn't matter, that you never saw the bigger picture. This city, this entire operation, it was always about control, power, and sometimes power demands sacrifice." Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together everything he was saying. The unsolved murders, the missing evidence, the corruption. None of it had been random. It had all been part of a larger plan, one that had been carefully orchestrated over the years. "Why?" Emily asked, though she already knew the answer. "Why murder innocent people? Why destroy lives?" Davis let out a low chuckle, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "Do you think the people at the top care about innocent lives, Emily? The world is built on compromises, on sacrifices. People die, people disappear, and in the end, the ones who survive are the ones who play the game best. It's all about making the right choices, about being willing to do what others won't." Emily took a step back, her hands clenched into fists. She had been right all along. The corruption ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. The mayor wasn't just a puppet. He was the mastermind behind it all. But even with the truth now in front of her, Emily refused to back down. The lives lost, the families shattered. They all deserved justice. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steely with conviction. "You may think you've won, that you've buried the truth, but you haven't. The truth always finds a way out, Davis. You can't hide from it forever." The mayor's expression darkened, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the mask of control slip. He took a step toward her, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "You've already dug your grave, Emily," he hissed, "and I'll make sure you don't get the chance to tell anyone else about this little game we've been playing." Before Emily could react, Mason, who had been sitting silently in the corner of the room, moved. He lunged at Davis with lightning speed, tackling him to the ground. The force of the impact sent both men crashing into the desk, knocking papers and coffee mugs to the floor. Davis fought back fiercely, his hands clawing at Mason's throat, but Mason was relentless. Emily didn't hesitate. She moved quickly to the door, pulling her phone from her pocket as she called for backup. Her heart raced as she waited for the response, the sound of struggle echoing in the background. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "Please come." The seconds felt like hours, but just as she was about to give up hope, the sound of sirens reached her ears. Police cars screeched to a halt outside the building, and armed officers burst into the room, guns drawn. Davis froze, his hands still clutching Mason's shirt as the officers restrained him. "Get off him!" one of the officers shouted, yanking Davis away from Mason. They cuffed him, dragging him to his feet. Mason took a deep breath, wiping blood from his lip as he stood up. "You did it, Emily," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "You brought him down." Emily nodded, but her mind was already racing, the weight of what had just transpired settling over her like a storm cloud. It wasn't over. Davis may have been arrested, but the network of corruption he had been a part of was still out there. The damage had been done, and the city would never be the same again. The officers escorted Davis out of the room, and Emily stood in the silence that followed. She looked at Mason, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than anger and fear. She felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you think we'll ever truly know the extent of it all?" Mason asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily looked at him, the weight of the question heavy on her shoulders. "I don't know, but we'll keep digging. We'll keep fighting." As the doors to the office closed behind them, Emily felt the weight of the truth settle into her bones. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.